So, welcome everyone to. It's been a while since we've met, and we're studying the Psalms in our Thursday night Zoom class. I'm really excited to have Nathan Ward visiting with us tonight, and he's going to be teaching Psalm 101. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Nathan, and we'll look forward to the discussion ahead.
Right. Well, thanks again for the invitation. It's good to be with you. Some of you I know a little bit, maybe. Some of you I know by name via social media, and some of you I don't think I know at all. But it's good to at least have a chance to see some faces and some names and know more people that we share a faith with. I chose Psalm 101 for two reasons. One, because Psalm 22 was already taken, and that's the first one that I was thinking about doing. But then Psalm 101 is a psalm that kind of has a special place to me, because this psalm was the text that I preached my first ever sermon from back when I was a sophomore at Florida College. And it was chosen with about as much thought as you'd expect a sophomore in college to choose a sermon topic from. I was kind of browsing through my Bible looking for something to preach about, and for some reason this one jumped out at me. And so I preached my first sermon from it, and of course I would return from time to time to it if I was visiting somewhere I hadn't preached before and needed a ready sermon. I could use that one. And then another sermon that I started working on pretty early on as well was an overcoming temptation sermon, where I was trying to get just very practical kinds of advice on overcoming temptation. And that ended up kind of being expanded into an entire series of lessons. But the very first lesson, several of the points, I ultimately kind of came back to realize that they were kind of drawn out of Psalm 101, even though I didn't know it at the time. And so in later years, when I was going back through that overcoming temptation lesson and it was becoming a series, I drew from Psalm 101 again to put that series together in a little bit of probably a better way than I covered either topic back when I was in college. So it is a text that I've spent a fair amount of time with, primarily the first few verses, less so the latter verses, although we'll talk about the entire thing tonight. So that's kind of my history with this psalm, if you're interested in it. If you're not interested in it, that's still my history with this psalm, I suppose. So one way or the other, that's where we begin. So let me tell you what my plans are for this evening. Working through this. I know there's kind of basically an hour for the lesson and an hour-ish or so for discussion afterward. I may try to scale back the first part. It's only an 8-verse psalm. And so we'll see how much I have to say about it. But I think there's just a lot of room for practical discussion about some of the principles here. And so we'll kind of see how the time goes. I'll play it by ear as I go, I suppose, with some of it. But what I'm going to do is start with some kind of background, contextual, structural sorts of issues with this psalm, as those can be at least a little bit helpful in seeing what's going on. Then I'm going to run through the psalm. We'll read it through together. And I'll talk about some details in the text. What does this word mean? What does this phrase mean? Those kinds of things. And hopefully clarify any of the more difficult or more significant elements there. And then I'm going to come back and talk about 3 of those principles on the overcoming temptation side of things that I think are drawn from this psalm, and lay those principles out, give some illustrations of the idea, and then we'll open it up to see what meat can be added to those bones that I put down. So that's kind of my plan. And I hope that's helpful to kind of see that out in advance. So Psalm 101, let me start by reading it. I'll probably read it a couple of times through. We'll read it. We'll talk about some of the background structural stuff, and we'll go from there. Let me toggle over to my Bible text. You guys can still hear me, right? Yeah? Okay. Psalm 101, I will sing of steadfast love and justice. To you, O Lord, I will make music. I will ponder the way that is blameless. Oh, when will you come to me? I will walk with integrity of heart within my house. I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless. I hate the work of those who fall away. It shall not cling to me. A perverse heart shall be far from me. I will know nothing of evil. Whoever slanders his neighbor secretly, I will destroy. Whoever has a haughty look and an arrogant heart, I will not endure. I will look with favor on the faithful in the land, that they may dwell with me. He who walks in the way that is blameless shall minister to me. No one who practices deceit shall dwell in my house. No one who utters lies shall continue before my eyes. Morning by morning, I will destroy all the wicked in the land, cutting off all the evildoers from the city of the Lord. So there's our text. It is the title of the psalm is that it's a psalm of David. That information, I don't know how much of that sort of thing you've talked about already in these, but that's probably not part of the very original text of the Psalms, but it goes back as far as we have manuscripts, and everyone believes, for the most part, that they're pretty accurate in terms of who wrote the Psalms, and where there's a historical superscription that tells you something about when it was written, like the Psalm of David's repenting of his sin with Bathsheba. Those all go back as far as we go, and they're traditionally pretty well trusted. So I don't see any reason to disbelieve that this is a Psalm of David. It's rare in that you don't find many Psalms of David this late in the Psalter. The book of Psalms is divided up into these 5 sub-books I'm sure you've seen before. This is in book 4 of the Psalms, and this is the only Psalm of David in all of book 4. In fact, it's only one of 2 Psalms in book 4 with a named author, this one in Psalm 90, the Psalm attributed to Moses. So in this section of the Psalter, you don't find a whole lot of this. This one is attributed to David. This one does not have a historical superscription that tells us when and why he wrote it. But there are some guesses I think we can make that are helpful to think about, at least, even if we can't have certainty. This does seem very Davidic in that it's the kind of commitment a king like David would make, a man who is a man after God's own heart, who wants to do the right kind of thing. The commitments in this psalm fit that very well. I do think it probably best fits David before his sin with Bathsheba, not because he's evil after that, but because there is just so much chaos in the kingdom after that. It just doesn't seem to jibe well with what we see going on there. And also because this seems like an early commitment. This is the sort of thing a king would say at the beginning. This is the kind of king I'm going to be. I'm going to do these things. I'm going to surround myself with these people. I'm going to lead this way. And so that fits very well with the early part of his reign as well. And then one last thing that fits that picture is there in verse 2, I believe it is. Yeah, verse 2. The thing that just seems completely out of the blue in this psalm, this question, oh, when will you come to me? And you think, well, what does that have to do with anything? And that's a really good question, and I'm not sure exactly that I can pin down exactly how that question fits into the entire context of the psalm. However, that does fit well with a historical event in the life of David, where the Ark of the Covenant has not yet come to Jerusalem. And he's trying to get it there. And of course, you've got the story of Uzzah and the Ark. We all know how that goes. And it doesn't go very well. And when you get down to 2 Samuel 6 and verse 9 in this story, David was afraid of the Lord that day. And he said, how can the Ark of the Lord come to me? And so he wants the Ark because this is, the visible presence of God. He wants that with him. And in 2 Samuel 6, the question is, how can it come to me? And in Psalm 101, it's, when will God come to me? Which can either be a very personal, spiritual sort of relationship, although I don't get the impression David ever felt a lack of that. When he's out tending sheep, God is with him and he knows God is with him. When he's fighting Goliath, God is with him and he knows God is with him. So when he says, when will you come to me? I think he's asking the same kind of question that he's asking over in 2 Samuel 6, which is not, I doubt that God is in my presence, as much as I want this symbol of God's presence with me, that being the Ark of the Covenant. And so this would fit the early part of David's reign as well. So that's my feeling on when this was written. For what that's worth, it puts it at the earlier part of David's reign. Now, after the time of David, of course, we all know that these Psalms were used. They continued to be used after the original context of the Psalm. And so what does it mean? How is it used after that? Again, we don't have any, grand Jewish traditions going back for centuries and centuries that tell us that. But if you just stop and think about it, you can read between the lines and guess at least that this would be a fantastic psalm for a new king to read in an inauguration ceremony. Psalm 2 is frequently thought of as an inauguration psalm. This psalm that is rooted in the Davidic promises: I will make you my son, I'll destroy your enemies. The nations rage against God's anointed one, and he laughs in their face and puts them all in their place because you can't stand against God's king. That idea is one very important idea for a new king. Well, this would be another really important idea for a new king. What is the kind of monarchy you're going to have? What is the kind of king you're going to be? And so whether it was or not used in that sense, it would fit very well in that sense. And we'll come back to that idea that would fit very well in that sense in a little bit. So Psalm 2, God's put the king in his place. God will defeat all the enemies. Psalm 101 is the king's commitment to justice. And that would make a spectacular inauguration ceremony. Whether it did or not, again, we can't know for certain. Well, the psalm itself, the structure of the psalm is pretty simple. It's broken down basically into two parts. Verses 1 through 4, you might call David's personal policy, how he's going to conduct himself. And then verses 5 through 8 would be David's public policy, the people he's going to surround himself with. And so it's really simple and straightforward in terms of how the psalm's put together, these two parts, how David's going to act, the kind of people David's going to be around one way or the other. It's also framed, as a lot of these psalms are. Have you guys talked about the idea of inclusio before? Is something that's come up?
No.
Inclusio is something that happens a lot in the Bible. It's when something is framed beginning and end with a sentence or a verse or a key word sometimes, or an idea. So a couple of easy examples of this. The end of the book of Judges begins with a statement: there was no king in the land and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And then the end of that section is: there was no king in the land and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so that is an inclusio around this section of the book of Judges. It frames the entire thing. And that tells you, among other things, that this entire section of the book of Judges is about this idea and explaining this idea that there's no king in the land. So, is it a good thing that there's no king in the land, or a bad thing that there's no king in the land? Well, it depends on whether the people are good or not. And you read all of that text in between, and it turns out they were not very good. Doing what was right in their own eyes was not the way to go. And so it's kind of paving the path for something. Psalm 8 is another example. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth is the first verse of that psalm, and then it's also the last verse of that psalm. And so everything else in between fits that. And so those are a couple of verbatim inclusio ideas. But they're also thematic sometimes. And so Psalm 101, it's not verbatim that way, but notice in verse 1, it begins with singing of steadfast love and justice. And then in verse 8, it ends with him doing justice, getting rid of the wicked, cutting off the evildoers, particularly, as we'll see, that's related to his role as the king. So it begins with justice and it ends with justice, is the framework around this particular psalm. And so there are two kinds of justice. There's a justice he's going to live in himself, and the justice he's going to expect in those around him. So justice is something of a key idea in this psalm as well. That gives us a little bit of background, I guess, in this psalm, and maybe sets the stage a little bit to talk about some of the details here. Well, let's work through the psalm itself. And again, I'm not going to talk about every single verse of this psalm and every single phrase. There's a time and a place for that kind of study. This, again, I think it's pretty straightforward, but there are a few phrases in particular that I think are worth stopping on and talking a little bit more about, just to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page. Starting with that first verse, I will sing of steadfast love and justice, because those two ideas, they go hand in hand in a variety of ways. They are clearly character traits of God. This steadfast love idea is fundamental to God's character. In God's self-revelation to Moses back in Exodus 34, a God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, that becomes its own refrain that is repeated a dozen or so times throughout the Old Testament. But God is a God of justice, is constant in the Old Testament as well. And so one of the questions that comes up, and some translations will even translate this different ways, is whose steadfast love and justice is David talking about? Is he talking about God's steadfast love and justice? and that's he's singing praise to God for who God is, or is he talking about his own steadfast love and justice? And this psalm is about the commitment that he's making to that steadfast love and justice of his own. I tend to think that the context better fits the latter view, that he is singing a psalm that is going to be his commitment to having this steadfast love and justice. And the rest of the psalm then fleshes out that idea and tells you what that steadfast love and justice is going to look like in his life. Now, that said, I don't know how fine of a line we can draw between the two. Because what is David's steadfast love and justice if it is not a reflection of God's steadfast love and justice? This isn't something David's just making up out of thin air and coming up with on his own. He's learned steadfast love and justice from the character of God, and it's only in as much as he is reflecting that character that he has it in his life at all. So I think this is a psalm of David's commitment to this in his life, but that as a reflection of God's steadfast love and justice as well, which is why he can also say in the same verse, to you, O Lord, I will make music. Now, some translations will stick a your, Y-O-U-R, in the first line. I will sing of your steadfast love and justice. That's not in the Hebrew text. That's a translation's interpretation, which may or may not be right. That's one of those things that happens in translations. This is ambiguous. It might mean David's, it might mean God's. And it's up to the reader to determine as best as he can what the context suggests. And my biggest objection to that kind of translation is that it's taking the decision out of my hands. Because if you see the your, you just presume that it's God. And if you're not, capable in the Hebrew, you're not going to know that. And which among us is, including me? I had 1 year of Hebrew about 12 years ago, so it's not good. I'm not going to sit down and open a Hebrew text and know all the answers. So, I can muddle my way through it barely, and that's about it. So, even with the little bit of a background on that I've had, I'm not going to know this without, more resources. So anyway, that's my take on the steadfast love and justice. I think it's also worth noting the connection between these two ideas, steadfast love or loving kindness or mercy, depending on your translation. This is a Hebrew word that gets translated a variety of ways depending on your translation that you're looking at. Shows up all over the Old Testament, and the problem with it is that it means all of those different things that I said: steadfast love, mercy, loving kindness. It means all of that, and it means more. There's no single English word that is a great translation for it because it's so encompassing of a word. One of the things that's important about it is that it almost always, if not always, carries with it covenant overtones. It's love in the context of covenant. It's mercy in the context of covenant. It's steadfast love in the context of covenant. And so this idea of a relationship that these behaviors are connected with is part of it as well. And so this mercy or love or steadfast love or covenant faithfulness, this and justice go hand in hand. And you stop and think about that just in terms of just narrowing it down to the word mercy for the sake of simplicity. How does mercy and judgment work together? That's always one of those questions, right? And one of the ways that at least one author put it that I think is helpful is he said that they reciprocally check each other. Mercy prevents justice from becoming too harsh. Justice saves mercy from becoming too flabby. I don't know if I would have used the word flabby there, but you get the idea that there is a balance between the two. And the Bible is abundantly consistent in its teaching that God is a God of complete justice and God is a God of complete mercy. And whether or not we can understand, the interworking of that or not, that is consistently the biblical teaching. And this is what David is hoping for in his own life as well. Into verse 2, the integrity of heart is an important phrase in that verse, not because it's difficult to understand, but because it's important in a couple of different ways. He's going to really, in the rest of this psalm, fill in the details of what that means. What does it mean to be a person of integrity of heart? Well, continue reading and you'll find the answer, is sort of the idea. But then also notice in verse 4, a perverse heart will be far from me. That's the antithesis of this. The heart of integrity is what he wants. The heart of perversity is what he doesn't want. And so those are your extremes. He wants the one and not the other. But then notice also that it's not just public obedience that David is talking about. It's one thing to go to the temple and do all your sacrifices and follow the law and be obedient. Well, that's great, but David doesn't just want outward obedience. He wants a heart of integrity as well. But then notice he doesn't just want a heart of integrity. He wants this everywhere he goes. So it goes from public, not just sacrificing, although that's not explicitly stated, but I will do this within my house, he says. Even in private, he will try to be this person of integrity, but not just doing the right things in private, but even in his innermost person to try to be a person of integrity as well. And let me also mention here on this point, since we're talking about the heart, that in the ancient conception, the heart was not what we think of the heart as. We think of the heart as this symbol of emotion. And that's not how they thought of the heart. We think that the brain is the intellect, the heart is the emotion. They thought of the heart as more closely aligned to intellect. Really, the heart was the whole person. The entirety of the person is what the heart was, but especially the intellect. By New Testament times, what we would call the heart, the emotions, is the bowels, is what they would say, which seems really weird to us, right? Try that one on a date one day. I love you with all my bowels. You make my bowels go pitter pat. And so, I mean, it just doesn't work in our idiom, but it makes sense when you stop and you think about it, because you've been nervous before, right? And you felt it in your gut. Or you heard bad news and you felt it in your gut. And so there's a strong emotional reaction in our gut, and that's why that idea comes about. But when he talks about the heart, he's not talking about emotions. He's talking about intellect and the entirety of who he is. So a heart of integrity, he wants to be a person of integrity all the way through, top to bottom, in and out, is the idea there as well. There is a bit of a tragic irony in this when he says, I will walk with integrity of heart within my house. David, as he's walking on top of his house that one night, and then what happens in his house after that. So, I mean, there is that tragic irony. He doesn't live up to what he wants to do. Of course, is the case of all of us. I mean, not to throw him under the bus and act like we're different from that. But there is that, I think that's worth noting as we go. In verse 3, it will not cling to me. And I don't know how every translation renders that. Some say cleave to me, or I will put it away from me. It is more literally something like it will not cleave to me, or it will not cling to me. And that idea there, and this is the work of those who fall away. So evil deeds will not cling to me. Notice in Hebrews 12, perhaps a more familiar text to us, therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So this idea of sin as something that clings to us, it doesn't want to let go of us. And sometimes we don't want to let go of it either, as far as that goes. But sin is something that wants to get its claws into you and not let go. And I think that's part of why over in Ezekiel 18, I believe it is, I probably should have written this down. It's just a fantastic text on repentance over there. And one of the things that he talks about is casting off from sin, or casting away from sin. And that could be read either, if I remember correctly, it can be read either as throwing it away from you, or casting yourself off away from it, in the sense of a ship casting off from the shore. You think about that, and that's a pretty striking kind of image because, I mean, when was the last time you were down at the port, down at the harbor, and you saw one of those big cruise liners cast off and then just kind of float around 100 feet out for a while? I mean, when they're casting off, they're getting out of there. They're not trying to cling or to let the shore cling to them. The analogy kind of breaks apart, but you get the idea. You're getting away from it. And this idea of sin being something that clings to you is a pretty thoroughly biblical idea. You've got to get away from it. You've got to get it out of your life as much as possible. We've talked about the perverse heart, at least briefly there in verse 4, which is the antithesis of the heart of integrity. In verse 5, we'll come back to this I will destroy idea when we get down to verse 8, when we talk about cutting off the evildoers. This is something that I think is directly related to David's role as the king, not something that all of us can just do, go around destroying people. And so this is more particularly related to what he's going to do as a king. There may be some, principle that we can draw from that. But verse 6, verse 5 is what I want. Whoever slanders his neighbor secretly, I will destroy. Whoever has a haughty look and an arrogant heart, I will not endure. And so that just awful attitude that nobody likes. And I mean, you get that in Proverbs, right? A proud look is something that the Lord hates. I think there's a lot of overlap. There was one commentary I was reading yesterday on this that I hadn't read before on this text that said, and I'm not sure that I buy it because I think there's more than that. He said there are 7 different declarations that David makes in this text. After saying, I'll walk with integrity of heart, there are 7 specific things he says he's going to do. And that may play out very well in the Hebrew, and I just can't tell. In the English, it looks like there's more than 7, and so I didn't want to present that when I hadn't really verified it any better. But he said they're not identical to the 7 things the Lord hates in Proverbs, but there's a lot of overlap between them. And whether there's 7 or not, I would say that if you look at this psalm and look at those 7 things the Lord hates, you're going to find a lot of familiarity in these 2 places, and maybe some a good study to do relating those 2 passages back and forth. And I guess I'll just leave that with you to think more about as far as we go. Verse 6, I will look with favor on the faithful in the land, that they may dwell with me. He who walks in the way that is blameless shall minister to me. So who is going to have favor on them? Who's going to dwell with him? Who's going to minister to him? What David is talking about here is surrounding himself with the best and the most capable people who are the best and the most capable in terms of advancing the interests of God, not in politics per se, not in having the best war strategy, but the people who share this kind of commitment to the ways of God are the people that he wants to surround himself with. And when you do that, that's when the kingdom can be strengthened. The kingdom is not going to be strengthened by surrounding yourself with the wrong advisors, as Solomon's son finds out, right? You've got to surround yourself with good advisors who will drive you closer to the Lord, not farther away from the Lord. And that's when the kingdom is going to be established very well. Verse 7 is another one of those things that ties in well with the evil of the list of 7 in Proverbs. Proud look, a lying heart. We've got the haughty look, an arrogant heart, and now the one who practices deceit. In verse 7, the one who utters lies, those will be out. I want the person of integrity, not the person of deceit. Again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward there. And then verse 8, finally, morning by morning I will destroy all the wicked in the land, cutting off all the evildoers from the city of the Lord. And this is where I think we kind of get the idea that some of the things that David is talking about doing here is, in the original context, he's talking about doing it in his role as the king. One of the things that the king did in his role as king was dispense justice. I mean, there were lower courts, but ultimately any major decisions, any difficult decisions would come to the king. And there was, station outside the gate where the elders would decide, and if they couldn't, it would be passed on to the king to make the decision. And there's a text even in 2 Samuel 15 about Absalom being out by the gate to kind of manage some of these cases that are coming to the king every morning. And so this was one of the primary jobs of the king day in and day out. And they began that work very early of dispensing justice. And so when David says, every morning I'm going to be dispensing justice, destroying the wicked of the land, cutting off the evildoers, what he's talking about is his role as the king and dispensing the justice of God in that kingly role in particular. And notice how it ends, cutting off the evildoers from the city of the Lord. That's a striking way for this psalm to come to a conclusion if this is David's commitment to the kind of king he is going to be. Because ultimately the kind of king he wants to be is a king that leads the people of the Lord's city to be the people of the Lord, to then ultimately be a city that is honoring the very God after whom this city is named. I mean, you can call it the city of the Lord, but if the Lord's not there, it's really not his city. Well, everything is his, you know what I mean, but it's not his city, even if it bears his name in that sense. And so what David wants is a city that is doing honor, doing justice to the name that is given as being the city of the Lord. So that's a run through of the text itself. The next question then is how does this apply? And this is the journey of Bible study all the time is, what does it first mean when it was written? And then how does that apply to us? And I think the step that we sometimes miss when we go through this process is an important step, which is where we stop and we say, not just what does the text command, but what is the principle that is rooted in that command? Because that's where things can change. I mean, we're not in a position where anyone's getting stoned or anything like that. We don't have kings around anymore. So how do we apply these ideas? Well, the first thing you have to say is, what is that eternal, timeless principle that stands behind the specific command? Ideas like arrogance. Well, do you cut them off from the land? Well, no, but you can cut them out of your life. But it's that idea of arrogance and being apart from arrogance. It's that principle that you say, what does this principle look like in the 21st century world today? And so it's looking for that principle is the part that I think we're trying to do. I don't know that we always stop and quantify that as well as perhaps we should. But one of the questions that I think we ask along these lines is then, who does this apply to today? We don't have kings anymore. There's no, Davidic monarch on a literal throne. There's a Davidic monarch on the throne of heaven, but we don't have a Davidic monarch on a literal throne. So obviously the president should read this psalm at the inauguration, right? Well, that'd be fantastic. You don't get me wrong. But I don't really think that's the point of it either. Or you might say, well, it's in the Bible and it applies to everybody. I'd say, well, yeah, of course. But is there anyone in particular that it might apply more to or apply in a different way to? And that's where I think where we come back again to thinking in principle terms. And the principle here is this man who is the leader of God's people and the spiritual leader of God's people is making a commitment to have in his personal life the same standard of conduct, or even maybe a higher standard of conduct than the people around him would have. And that idea, when you stop and think about it, you can immediately know where that goes, right? Who are the spiritual leaders of God's people today that might want to give a little bit more consideration to this psalm and say, does this apply to me in a unique way because I'm a leader of God's people, like David was a leader of God's people, a leader of God's people that has to be held to a higher standard, a leader of God's people that is part of, in some sense, even dispensing justice within a congregational setting, if, God forbid, it comes to that sort of situation at certain times in terms of church discipline. So I think there is a sense in which spiritual leaders of God's people may want to take extra note of this psalm and the kind of commitment that David is making here. Well, like I said, I want to end this section, and we're right about at 8:40 almost. So I'll try to go through this relatively quickly, maybe get through it by 8:50 or so, and then we can kind of open the floor. But I've got to warn you, this at least used to be a full sermon, so I'll try to not do that to you. Sorry, my phone's ringing. I need to turn it off. So let me point out three things. First of all, in verse 2, I will ponder the way that is blameless. That idea, I think, is very important. The idea of pondering the blameless way. And the reason I say that is because I think too often we find ourselves pondering the sinful way rather than the blameless way. And I don't mean by that we sit around thinking, oh, I can't wait to sin. What I mean is that we far too easily think, oh, I'm going to sin. I'm only human. It's inevitable. I'm going to stumble. Yeah, we all sin. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one. And on and on and on we can go with those passages. And those passages are there. I mean, we can't deny that there are biblical affirmations of universal sin, but we can't take those biblical affirmations of universal sin and turn those into an excuse for constantly sinning, as if we don't have a choice in the matter, as if it's just an inevitability of life and we're going to continually do it. I mean, I'm sure you've all been in those congregations where at some point there's been 5 different prayers led in an hour, and every single one of them is asking for forgiveness of sins. And that's a noble thought, but I sure hope there aren't a whole lot of people that need 5 different prayers for forgiveness of sins within an hour. I mean, maybe someone does, but maybe that person should be growing more too. Sin is not something that we can't avoid. The Bible also says the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations. The Bible also says, blessed is the man who endures temptation. The Bible also says, no temptation has overtaken you except is common to man, and the Lord will always provide a way of escape. And when we say I'm only human, and I have faults, and I have weaknesses, and I this and I that, we are denying the truth of Galatians 2, that it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And that should be the perspective that we have. Yeah, I'm probably going to fail. I'm probably going to make mistakes along the way, but I don't have to. And I certainly don't need any excuses for it happening. The illustration that I like to give of this idea is rooted in one of my favorite times of the year. I don't know you all well enough to know how many of you are sports fans, but I love March Madness. The NCAA basketball tournament is just so much fun in a way that many other sporting events aren't. And one of the reasons why is every year you have these absolutely insane, crazy, impossible upsets where you've got one of the best 4 or 5 teams in the country playing against a team that's like, 67 or something. And somehow that nobody beats them. You've never even heard of this school until the game starts, and somehow they win. You ever wondered how they pull that off? Well, let me suggest to you, one of the ways they pull it off is because they believe that they can win. If they believed that they could not win, if they believed that they did not have a chance, if they believed they did not belong in the same court as these big boys, they would get blown off that court. The only way they ever win is because they believe they can. The moment you resign to defeat before the battle starts, the moment you have already lost the battle. Yeah, it's true that sometimes a team that thinks it can win will lose, but never has a team that believed it would lose won. Ponder the blameless way, because if you don't believe you can win, you won't win. Secondly, I will walk with integrity of heart within my house. You think about those amazing Bible characters like Daniel and his friends who stand up to kings, like Joseph who refused to compromise his morals in a situation that would make other teenagers just melt to mush. You think of Paul who faced unimaginable persecution from our perspective, and you say, how did these guys do it? At least that's what I say. I mean, I look at my life and the mistakes that I've made and the stupid things I've done, and I look at them and I think, how on earth did they do it? Well, David's statement here, I think, is helpful. When he says, I will walk with integrity of heart within my house. You see, this is a choice. I mean, that's a bit simple, isn't it? But that's what it is. It's choice. It's a choice to integrity. In Daniel chapter 1, before the conflict over the food there in verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. The same thing is true of anyone who is successful in overcoming temptation. You don't wait for the temptation to begin before you make a decision. You decide what you're going to do before the temptation ever arises, and then you force Satan to have to change your mind. If we're standing there deliberating on the matter in the middle of the temptation, we've already lost. Because what we're doing then is looking at the temptation and looking how appealing it is and trying to decide what we're going to do when already we know what we're going to do because we're thinking about how appealing it is. We have to make the decision well in advance. I mean, Joseph wasn't succeeding because he was standing there in Potiphar's house considering the matter while Potiphar's wife was tugging on his robe. He knew what he needed to do, and he got out as fast as he could because the decision was made before the situation arose. Daniel and his friends were successful because the decision was made before the situation arose. And on down the line we could go. You have to decide in advance. You have to have the inertia moving in your favor, and that's the only way you can hope to overcome. And you see that holiness doesn't just happen. We must choose to be righteous. We must choose to be people of integrity. And finally, then, I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless. It's still a choice. But notice this time the choice is to avoid things that aren't good for you. In terms of temptation, we could say avoid tempting situations. And the first key to that is to know yourself. And when I say know yourself, I mean like honestly, really know yourself. Not know the person you want everyone else to see you as, but really know who you are. Admit to yourself who you are. Admit what tempts you. Admit what is going to cause you to stumble. And then as much as you can control it, avoid the people, places, and circumstances that bring you into temptation. If you ever been in that situation where you find yourself having sinned and you think, well, God, where was my way of escape? Well, maybe the way of escape was not going to where you knew the temptation was going to be in the first place. Sometimes that's the way of escape that God gives us, is the decision to avoid the circumstance that we know is going to lead us into temptation. Temptation is not an extreme sport. We're not pushing our limits. We're not seeing how far we can go over without going over the line. We're not about getting an adrenaline rush by, almost failing, but not. That's not what this is about. We should stay as far away from it as we possibly can. Again, that Ezekiel passage, cast off, get away from it. Don't let it cling to you. In terms of bad situations creating the sin, I'm always reminded of Ecclesiastes 10, he who digs a pit will fall into it. And I don't know that the point of that in its context is about temptation, but I always think about it. You dig yourself a hole. You talk about that in your relationship with your spouse, right? You just keep on digging, buddy. You just keep on digging. Well, the same thing's true with temptation. You dig yourself a hole, you're just going to fall into it, is what you're going to wind up doing. And we see people do that over and over again. Now, only like one last analogy as I think about this, and then I'll be done and we can have some discussion about it all. I imagine most of you have seen at some point in your life some really bad horror movie. If nothing else, you've seen that commercial that's going around lately where there's the horror scene and the killer, and they're saying, let's get in the running car. And they say, no, let's hide behind the running chainsaws. Yeah, that one. We've all seen that movie. There's a million of them. They're terrible. And in the movie, there's a killer in the house. And there's always some girl, I don't know why it has to be a girl, but there's always some girl on the sidewalk in front of the door thinking really hard about going into that house. And if you're anything like me, you're watching the movie going, are you serious? Are you kidding? You can't be so stupid as to go in that house. Anyone with half a brain would know that if you go into that house, you're going to die. What kind of moron are you? It doesn't take any sense at all. And I just get more and more frustrated as it goes, right? And then, of course, what happens? Well, she goes in the house, and then she dies. And, really? really, it doesn't take any sense. You have to have known what was going to happen. And I bring that up because sometimes I wonder what my life would look like if it were a movie. And temptation was in the house, and I was the idiot standing on the sidewalk. And people were watching going, surely you can't be so stupid. Anyone with half a brain would know that if you go in that place, you're going to sin. If you go spend time with those people, you're going to sin. If you put yourself in that circumstance, you're going to sin. And I happily walk through the door. I imagine we've all been there too. It's not a pleasant place to be. And it's even worse when you realize you're the stupid person from the horror movie. But that's why we have to decide in advance what we're going to do. And so those three things, when it comes to overcoming temptation, I mean, I don't think there's any pat solution to overcoming temptation. I can't give you 5 principles and you're always going to win every battle. There's no such thing. But these three things I think are really important because they all happen long before temptation begins. And so again, first of all, ponder the blameless way, which I would summarize as believe that you can win, don't give up before the fight starts. Secondly, purpose purity in your heart. Purpose, decide in advance what you're going to do. And then finally, as far as you possibly can, keep yourself out of tempting situations. Now, there's more to be said in other sermon series and lessons about what you do in temptation, but that's not part of Psalm 101. So I'll leave it at that for now, and that'll conclude my part of this, and then we can have whatever discussion needs to be had at this point.
Appreciate those thoughts, Nathan. And want to, who has a question or a comment that you'd like to share about this psalm or any of the comments that Nathan said? Want to give an opportunity. Yeah, Gordon, go ahead. You're still muted. Can you unmute, Gordon? You're still muted.
Richard, can you unmute him?
When will you come to me, as referring to the bringing in of the ark? Am I being heard?
No.
Now you are. We missed everything until the very last thing you said.
Okay, can you hear now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this would have to be a very early psalm of David's in that event. And I have taken it in the past when I've tried to teach it and when I wrote on the psalm that it has reference to the beginning of David's entrance into the kingship over the full nation. And that this is more or less, I thought of it as his inauguration speech, that he is promising an administration of justice. And that being so, he uses certain terminology here that suggests the covenant that God has made with him of an eternal kingship. Because, of course, God promised that to David's descendants, the kingdom would always belong, and we see that finally fulfilled in the Messiah as he reigns now. But if that is so, then is it not most likely that when he talks about the walking with a perfect heart in my own house in verse 2, and in verse 7, I don't want any deceivers or crooked people around me in my house, that he's talking about not his dwelling place or not his own family, as some commentators talk about how you should be kind to your own family and so forth, but rather he's talking about his house as the kingship itself, almost certainly he uses the term that way in the 23rd Psalm in the addenda, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. If that was written, as most believe, at the time of the rebellion of Absalom, then it is an assurance that he will keep the kingship that God has covenanted to him. So is it not likely that he's using that here, that what he is saying is, I'm going to have an administration of complete justice. The
Yeah.
kind of thing God wants me to be and to do as king. In my administration as a king, I will walk in with a perfect heart. I will treat everyone with fairness and justice. And I will not have as a part of my advisors, my administrators, those who work with me in my government, people that are not the same kind of people insofar as I'm able to. Now, that's my thought on the psalm, and would appreciate any comments on it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that word house is one of those words that, what does it mean? Well, it depends on the context, right? Sometimes it's a building you live in. In 2 Samuel 7, he wants to build God a house, and that's the temple. But God says, no, I'm going to build you a house, and that's the Davidic dynasty, not just, his own royal administration. And then sometimes house can mean something like his royal administration. And so, any word with that kind of semantic range, it's going to depend on context. I think you're right that and I agree with you, this is very early Psalm. This is David's commitment to the kind of king he's going to be. And so in that sense, house might include his private house, but it wouldn't be limited to that. And primarily it has to do with, especially, continuing on in verses 5 and following, it becomes more clear that he's talking about a more public sort of policy, where there it's definitely, he's talking about the people that are ministering to him, the people that are going to dwell with him. And that's very clearly his, royal administration, you might say. Earlier, it might mean that as well. It might mean that and more. But I certainly wouldn't say that it can't mean that all the way through the entire psalm. It may well just be the entirety of the psalm is about that, like you're saying.
Yeah, thank you.
So especially when you're talking about a royal house, you're talking about the house of David, and we see it referred to the house of David even outside of the Bible. And when you're looking at a royal dynasty, it was always, the house of who started that dynasty. You have the House of Windsor in the UK. So I think really that's referring to this. To me, a house is all that is under the control of someone. And so like a household in ancient Rome may have been the leader of the house, the father, the children, all of the dependents that lived with them, all of the slaves, et cetera, were all part of his house or household. And when you have a country like Israel with David over it, his house is everyone that reports up to him and depends upon him for leadership.
And I think that's right as well. I would say that we probably can limit this to not being the full Davidic dynasty in reference here, because David can only control what he can control. When he says, I'm going to walk with integrity in my house, he's not talking about what Jehoshaphat's going to be doing several generations from now. I mean, he may hope that that's what he'll be doing too, but this is the commitment that he's making at his particular moment in time. And so obviously, of course, it's his administration, his household, whether it's, the political side, the servants, the family. And I do think even that it still can, at least in this broader context, have a narrower focus to what David's going to say he's going to be doing, personally and privately as well. That would fall under that umbrella, even if it's not the primary concern. Oh, there was something that came up in the chat I saw.
Yeah, I want to give a chance to read Martha's comment in the chat. and get your thoughts on that, Nathan. She says, pondering the way that is blameless she sees as avoiding sins of commission, and then walking with integrity is trying to avoid sins of omission. Interesting thought.
Yeah. We use that terminology a lot, sins of commission and sins of omission. I think that's a helpful way of thinking about sin. I don't know that the Bible ever uses that terminology specifically, and that's not to say that we can't use it because the Bible doesn't. I mean, we like to say Bible things and Bible words for Bible things, except Bible. So we're not completely consistent on that idea. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't use that terminology. It's kind of a categorizing of sin that I don't know that the Bible ever does quite so systematically. And so I guess my question is, would those two ideas in this psalm be limited to those two kinds of sins? And I don't know that they are, and I don't know that you're saying they are either. So I guess let me be clear on that as well. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. Maybe that's just a good reflection that you're offering, which is if we think of these ideas of sins that you do something wrong or sins that you don't do something you're supposed to be doing, and these two phrases can relate to those kinds of ideas and help us avoid those two types of sins. Maybe I'm saying too much and making more of it than you intend to make.
Kathleen?
I thought of another analogy, but this is when it comes to temptation and God providing a way of escape. It's a lesson that you preached back in the 80s, Rick, that I always remember, maybe because I played tennis, but the idea that, someone hits the ball to you and, you accidentally lob it way up in the air and they're standing there waiting to kill it. And that's not the point at which you go, help me, Lord. I mean, you shouldn't hit the lob up in the air that set you up to be destroyed. And I think, that's a lot of the ways we get ourselves into trouble, is that we're not paying attention to what we're doing. And then we find ourselves in the bad situation. And there's a book, Get Out of That Pit. And I'm not going to remember the woman's name that wrote it, but she talks about how you end up in a pit because somebody pushed you in it. You end up in the pit because you accidentally fell into it. And sometimes you end up in the pit because you knew it was there and you jumped in on purpose. And in any case, you need to get out. But, the whole idea of being more aware of temptation and where the pit is going to help you stay out more likely.
Or you got the adrenaline rush from balancing on the edge of the pit and see how close you could get, which is the point Nathan made also.
So this psalm reminded me of those signs that people put in their house that say, in this house we ask forgiveness, whatever they are. And it just seems like this would be a real good place to go to make your own sign that's like that. And it's Beth Moore who wrote that book, Get Out of That Pit.
Oh.
If I can comment on the pondering the blameless way. As we strive every day to get closer and closer to Jesus and to keep our minds always just one thought away from God in each and everything we do, a lot of times we'll use the example of taking an optimistic view or a pessimistic view. We can spend our time looking at sin, or we can spend our time thinking about being godly. And, I always like to use be on the offense or be on the defense, so another sports analogy, and having the right mind. And so this now is a verse that I will probably use real soon.
Yeah, I will say that, however, I found this psalm in my sophomore year that led me to preach a sermon out of it. It was a pretty good find. There's a lot of good stuff here. It is the sort of thing you want to hang up in your house and think about all the time. And I mean, verses that you want to commit yourself to this same sort of thing as well. I mean, there's a reason it jumped out at me when I stumbled across it.
Yeah, I appreciated the point too about pondering the thing that's blameless and putting those type of thoughts in your mind. It makes me think of
Philippians 4.
Philippians, yes. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, think on these things. And I really interpret that to be filling your mind with the good things and avoiding filling your mind with negative.
Let me say something on that text. I wish I had something that I could show you where I've kind of laid it out, because not all translations do well with this. But 4:8 that you just quoted or paraphrased very closely, and 4:9 have parallel phrases in them. 4:8 says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's anything of excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, these things think. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, these things do, and the God of peace will be with you." Those two verses go together. These things think, these things do. And it's one of those spots where it's kind of unfortunate that we've kind of fallen in love with 4:8 is this verse to hang up in your house as well, and divorced it from 4:9, because it's not enough to just ponder the blameless way. Then you've got to get out and do it. And it's the thinking and doing that go hand in hand so frequently in the Bible, shows up there as well.
So Nathan, I liked your thoughts on verse 2 about when this may have happened, where, "Oh, when will you come to me?" is on Wednesday nights. I've been leading a study going through the United Kingdom, and we were in 1 Kings chapter 8 with the dedication of the temple and the ark being brought into the temple last night. And just a lot of the imagery there and talking about how all nations will turn toward where God is dwelling, and having a permanent dwelling place instead of being in the tent in the wilderness and around Israel, all shows that David and then Solomon, his son, were wanting to bring God into Jerusalem. And so where they are, and I think that really pulls into verse 2. So I think that was a really good thought.
Yeah, Gordon.
Yes, I'm going to have to leave. I just wanted to say good night to everyone, to thank Nathan for the fine job. I learned some things tonight that I needed to learn. And I want to thank all of you whose prayers have been lifted for me through this period when I've had the COVID-19. I know that it was your prayers, the prayers of the many who have been talking to the Lord about me, that caused him to be so merciful to me and to make this not worse than it was. So thanks to all of you. And of course, my thanksgiving always to the God of heaven. So good night, everyone.
Thank you, Gordon. Good night to you too. We are thanking God too for you.
Yes, good night.
Oh, good night, Martha. She's signing off as well. Anybody else need to run? We'll stay and talk longer, but if you want to
I
say
also,
goodbye, go ahead and
Yeah,
say goodbye.
good night. I'm going to sign off as well.
Okay,
My
Michelle.
husband just wrote me a note a little while ago. He had to go. He's staying with his mom for overnight, so he needed to go take care of her, but he wanted to make sure to let you and our public speaker here. My mind just
Nathan.
went like Nathan.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Nathan.
No problem.
He really appreciated it, and I did too. I really liked everything you had to say. But you guys have a good night. Thank you again.
Good night. Good to see
We
you,
appreciate
Michelle.
it. Jim and Jen is heading out. Thank you.
Okay,
Good
bye-bye.
night, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Nathan.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.
We enjoyed it.
Yeah, I had just a comment here. that sort of goes a little off track of what we've been talking about, but verse 5 kind of struck me in relationship to what Gordon was talking about at the beginning of brethren biting and devouring one another. And here it talks about the one who slanders his neighbor secretly, I will destroy. I mean, how much more those who do so publicly, who slander one another publicly on social media or whatever. And then it sort of relates back to the idea of integrity as well. We have people constantly posting false information on a platform like Facebook in regard to the election and so forth, or COVID-19 or whatever it is. And, certainly there, you say there are different viewpoints on those two things, but, things that are false are they're false. And it doesn't show integrity on our part when we don't do our due diligence to research or just refrain from putting it there to begin with, so we don't have to deal with it. Because, in the long run, what does it matter? That as Christians, our purpose is still the same. Ultimately, whatever situation that we find ourselves in. So,
of course, in the longest run of all, it matters extremely if by your words you will be justified and by your words you'll be condemned.
Right.
The things that we say without thinking or forward along without investigating and perpetuating lies. It's a terrifying thing. Social media is, in terms of the danger we're constantly putting ourselves in at the click of a button, and the hundreds of people that you can do that before.
It's a really good point.
Rick, one of the things I was thinking about referring, when Laura referred to verses that you would hang up in your house, a lot of these verses is what I would call switch plate verses. I would print these out and put them in the switch plates in my house, in each room.
Oh, nice. So when you're turn on and off the lights.
Yeah. There's a lot of these verses you could do that with.
Good. Yeah, I wanted to share, Nathan, one of the applications that in terms of, and I like the way you framed it in terms of avoiding temptation, putting focus there. And it seemed that in some ways, the second half, it was, how to maintain your integrity and avoid temptation by the people that you surround yourself with and by what you're willing to put up with in terms of evil. So he's wanting those around him who are good and faithful and walk blameless, who are humble, who share the traits that he's wanting to emulate. And he wants to keep away from him the people that are going to drag him down or be more likely to coarsen him or tempt him to behave in ways that are not right.
One of the things I didn't talk about that I meant to, and I don't know if I skipped it in my notes or I forgot to write it down, is there in verse 4, a perverse heart shall be far from me. Does anyone have a different translation of that? The first line of verse 4?
The American Standard says, depart from me.
Will depart from me?
A perverse heart shall depart from me.
Okay. And most translations do one of those two things. And the question is he saying someone else who has a perverse heart, I'm sending them away, which would fit very well with the rest of this psalm? Or is he saying, I will not let a perverse heart reside within me? A perverse heart will depart from me, will be far from me because I won't have that in my life. And that's just one of those difficulties because it is kind of ambiguous in the original. But I always hesitate to say maybe the author is being intentionally ambiguous because it can mean both, because that's not what authors do. Authors usually mean something they don't mean to be ambiguous. So that's kind of a cop-out that we fall back on sometimes. But I would say that because of the ambiguity, it serves as a really good transition verse. because David doesn't want to have a perverse heart within himself, obviously, if he's a man after God's own heart. But one of the ways you don't have a perverse heart in yourself is people with perverse hearts, you keep them away from you as well. And so David probably meant one or the other originally, but it does really good double duty as that transition from the first half of the psalm, which is his personal policy, to the last half of the psalm, which is his public policy, and deals with these other people that he doesn't want around him. And so it kind of is a good transition because of the ambiguity.
Kathleen?
A little bit like it's summarizing from the first 3 verses, because if he does all those things, then he's not going to have perverseness of heart with him if he's singing of loyalty and justice and studying the way that's blameless and walking integrity and not setting his eyes before things. Well, if those are the things he does, then perverseness won't be with him because he's not given any room for it. He's not introduced it in any way. He's filled his life with the good things.
And I do tend to think that verse 4 goes with the first 3 verses, and it's talking about his heart. He wants a heart of integrity, not a heart of perversity. In that contrast, and then the latter half is the other people. But again, I think it does do that nice double duty as well.
I think,
it is probably that summary idea.
I think verse 7 is the best verse out of this psalm for using in social media. No one who practices deceit shall be in my social media. No one who utters lies shall continue on my social media.
I will unfriend those who utter deceit.
Yeah. But I have a personal thing on who I have in social media and what I see from people. And it's people that are dear to me, family, friends. To me, it's sometimes good to see what they're posting on social media so that I know when to pray for them. And if you totally cut them off, they don't see what you post. And you can't influence them by what you're posting that's positive. And so it's one of those really double-edged thing. It's like, do I really want to see what they're doing and have it influence me? But it's important for you to know when, maybe they have a cry for help and need something.
You can't mute them for like 30 days.
Yeah.
Just setting. I've used that.
I have
quite
a few
often.
like that post about 50 things a day that are just totally worthless, like
Oh my gosh.
some pictures or music thoughts or something, and it's just like, okay.
Verse 3 is another good social media verse. I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless.
Right.
Wow, that takes care of a lot of what gets posted.
I think too, when you were talking about, how it applies today, I think not just elders, but I think the head of, the husband, the father, these are the kinds of things that someone who's leading the home, needs to make that kind of a commitment to, because we all follow that lead. We're all subject to that, or if they're, if the lead's not there, it makes it all the harder for those who are following.
And teachers who are teaching the word, and older women who are being good examples to younger women, and older men who are being examples to younger men. It's all of our responsibility to.
Yeah. I was going to say we're a kingdom of priests, right?
Yeah.
We're all priests.
Yeah.
I appreciated I was not thinking of it at first, and it just lit up that how obvious that was, that it needed to be read with special application to a king who was leading his people. And so I really appreciated your framing it in that way. That helped me. One of the things that feels potentially problematic about this psalm is that generally in churches of Christ that I've been associated with, there is a there's a danger of being judgmental and condemning of everyone that's, that's not as pure as we are, and isolating ourselves from them, and putting all those sinful people away from us. And so there's always this tension between, or finding the reconciliation between the example of Jesus, who ate with sinners and associated with the sinful all the time, and our need to condemn sin and make sure that it's clear that we don't condone it, and that we don't surround ourselves with people who can tempt us, at the same time. And I'm wondering if Nathan or any of the others of you have thoughts about that.
Depends on how safe of a place this is for me to talk about my thoughts about these things. Yeah, I think that's right. In terms of, that is a tendency that we have, at least like you say, the churches that I've been associated with. There is a mentality that, we are the one true church and no one else who wears the name Christian is a Christian. They're all pseudo-Christians of some kind. And the reason why, I don't know that we would come out and say it this way, but the reason why is because we have the right doctrine about A, B, C, D, and E, whatever those may be. We're right about this, we're right about this. They're wrong about this, they're wrong about this. Therefore, we're right, they're wrong, we're the church, they're not. And at some point, whether we want it to be this or not, we end up teaching a salvation based on our correct understanding. And that's a really, really dangerous place to be. Because anytime I think that I'm saved because of something that I've done, my trust is in me. And anytime my trust is in me, my trust is misplaced. I remember being at a different congregation from where I am now, for the few of you that know where I am now, but it was a different church. And there was a visitor that was there and prayed a prayer that included the phrase something very much like, we hope that everything that we've done has been pleasing in your sight, but if not, if we've done something wrong, we ask that you would accept it in the spirit that it was intended, rather than any error that we did it in. I thought, that's a really nice sentiment. And I bet everyone else here thought that was a really nice sentiment. And I bet at least 75% of those same people would think that if the Methodists down the street prayed that, it wouldn't work. And I wondered at that point, what's the difference? If that prayer works for me, if I've done something wrong and God will accept it in the spirit that I intended, if that will work for me, why won't it work for them? Is there, as long as you're at least 85% right in your theology and doctrine, then the prayer will work. But once you're below 85%, then it doesn't work anymore. Again, I don't want to try to draw any hard and fast lines or say that everybody's perfectly okay or teach any kind of, universalism within Christendom or anything like that. But I would say we need to be very careful about putting ourselves on the seat that God sits in, which is saying who is a Christian and who is not, who is saved and who is not, who is his child and who is not. That is way above my pay grade. And I can talk about the Bible as I understand the Bible, but in the final analysis, it's not for me to say whether someone else is saved. That's God's business.
I was in a congregation where one of the members would often say, my current understanding of this is, and his understanding could change over study and learning from others. And that's what we all have to look at, is that, we as Christians, all of our understandings of the Bible may be a little bit different based on our backgrounds, our study, etc. And we're always striving to learn more about God's will and his word.
And not everything is of equal importance. I mean, in Corinthians alone, obviously, what you do with meat that was purchased in the marketplace isn't a big deal unless there's someone that's going to make a big deal out of it. But if you don't believe in the resurrection, you got a major problem. So, I mean, I don't want to say that you can just be wrong about anything. Obviously not. You know, if you don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, you're really not a Christian by any definition of Christianity that I see in the Bible. Now, if God wants to save you some other way, that's his business, not mine, but I don't see that happening in the Bible. But if there's a disagreement about other kinds of things, I think there comes a point where it becomes very hard to worship with someone that you have very, very different views about certain things, but whether that makes them a Christian or not, lost or saved, again, that's my feeling is that's not my place to say. My current understanding is that that's not my place to make that judgment.
I've always said that people might be very surprised on the day of judgment to see who gets in, who doesn't.
Yep.
Because, I mean, as you say, that's God's call. That's not mine. And I don't need to be judging people's eternal state. I can teach them my understanding. Here's what I think the Bible teaches, and I can logically explain why I believe that's the way that it is. But it doesn't necessarily guarantee that what I'm saying is right.
I mean, Matthew 7, those people are pretty surprised. Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name?
Right.
I mean, here people going around doing a bunch of good stuff. And that's one of my favorite examples is that Matthew 7, and then Matthew, is it 25 or 26, the other judgment scene?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, they're obviously different things. Didn't I prophesy in your name? Didn't I cast out demons in your name? Didn't I do many mighty works in your name? Versus I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. And so they're two different kinds of things. But what always stands out to me is that in Matthew 7, they're saying, Jesus, Jesus, look at me and look at everything I did. And then in the later example, Jesus is saying, hey, look at you and look at what you did. And they're saying, when did I do this? And so, you know, there are difference in the things that are being done, but a big difference is who's doing the counting. If I'm piling up my good deeds and saying, look at all the great things I've done, I'm teetering towards salvation by works. If I'm the Luke 17 servant who says, I'm an unprofitable servant, I've only done what is my duty to do, I'm not counting my good deeds, and when God tells me about them later on, I'll be shocked at how much I've actually done, that's trusting in Jesus rather than trusting in me. And that's ultimately where we need to be. Like I said, if my trust is in me, my trust is misplaced. My trust must be in Jesus for my salvation, because I'm not going to make it apart from him.
Amen.
Richard, I was thinking about when you were first making your statements about the lack of compassion that we see in the church quite often because of doctrine differences or small differences. And it's that compassion that Christ showed for us that we should generate from within ourselves and from within our congregations for other people or for the world to see, so that we have opportunity to talk to them.
Yeah, and it's not just for people that use instrumental music. It's for blatant sinners, people that are doing the stuff that everybody agrees are sinners, that we should have compassion for them.
Absolutely.
Appreciate that,
Yes.
Ralph.
And one way that I look at what you're saying, I agree with. But my philosophy is I do not believe in church doctrine. I do not teach church doctrine, any church doctrine. It's only the Bible doctrine is what I try to teach. And when my understanding of that is different from what the Bible says, then I need to change. And I hope that I'm always open-minded enough to be willing to change, not wishy-washy, so that I'm going back and forth all the time, but open-minded enough that when I see where I need to change, then I need to change.
That's right. The Bereans searched the scriptures daily. They were more noble-minded.
Well put, Bill. Thank you. So, hey, Carlos, I saw you wrote something in the chat, but you haven't spoken up any tonight. Is there anything you'd like to share?
Well, I think it is about the same in my comment. Thank you, brother. I appreciate this opportunity to meet with you. My name is Carlos. I'm from Chile. Brother Ray, maybe some brothers didn't know something about me. But thank you for this Bible class, Brother Nathan, and appreciate a lot the emphasis about that. In truth, we can overcome temptation and sin. I think I agree that we need, as a Christian, to be more or have more confidence about this truth, because it's a daily battle for all of us. And I agree that it's true. Sometimes we think all the people that we are human beings, and so maybe for this reason we sin. But I think that is not the explanation. I like this process in verse 3, and about that David was talking about his decision to avoid bad things, and not because he was the king, but all people need to think in this principle for to win this battle. And so thank you, brother, for emphasize this truth. That I remember the story about in Judges. I think they show that they was unsuccessful to win and overcome other nations, because they think that they cannot, they are not so strong, even though God was with them, and they know about the power of God. And that is the same maybe for us in this thought, because we in advance think that it's very difficult to overcome temptation or to overcome sin. And so thank you, brother.
That makes me think, especially the men of Dan, is they could not take their territory, so they went up to Laish and took Laish, King Dan, and it was that whole attitude that they could not overcome their enemies because they were not powerful enough. So good.
Entire nation, Kadesh Barnea before that even.
Yeah.
Hey, Nathan, I was thinking about another example when you were talking about David surrounding himself, and examples of being ready, like you brought up Joseph and Daniel. And I was thinking about David when he was on the run from Saul, and he was surrounded by his 600 men, and their attitude was they wanted to kill Saul, and even to cast a spear through him. But David was ready in his mind to not to hurt God's anointed one. So it's just another example you can add to your queue.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to be wrapping this up. I want to give a final chance if anyone would like to make any closing comments before we break up the meeting.